Okay, everybody, this is our last lesson, our last recorded lesson of the term. This is on qualitative research. In this lesson, we'll look at um, interviews, textual analysis, focus groups, and ethnographic or field ethnographic observations. And so I just want to remind you that, we've spent the entire term talking about quantitative methods, and there's a reason we spend more time on quantitative methods. That's because really the majority of the work in our field continues to be quantitative. So, and if you look at the textbook, for instance, and most of the textbooks that teach research methods in mass communication, there tends to be a pretty heavy quantitative bias. Now, that does not and should not devalue qualitative research. I'd actually like to teach an entire course on qualitative research methods, and that's done at many universities, particularly when you get into graduate school, and there are research methods books dedicated to qualitative methods. But in our case, it's very quantitative heavy. So we're kind of squeezing all the qualitative stuff into one lesson, and we're going to look at 4 different methods. So we looked at 3 quantitative methods, right? Experiments, content analysis, and surveys. And we're going to look at 4 qualitative methods. There are more than that, but these are 4 of the main methods that are used in mass communication research. So let's start with interviews. Interviews are a very important qualitative method. It's a great way. Interviews are a great way to get information from people. You don't have to resort to a survey, right, to get information. You can sit down with somebody and have a conversation with them. You can get their ideas on something, their thoughts, their opinions, their attitudes, their motivations. And interviews are great because I thought I had a slide in here. I thought I had a slide in here about the advantages of interviews. I guess I don't. But let me just say that the main advantage of an interview over a survey is that you can get more in-depth. And that's the main advantage of qualitative research in general. You can get more in-depth in qualitative research than you can with quantitative research. That is generally true. So just think about this. I could sit down and I could distribute a survey, ask you 10 or 15 questions, and you're just going to hit A, B, C, D, whatever. But if I sit down with you, I'm able to see your facial expression. I'm able to hear the tone in your voice. I'm able to let you explain how you feel about something, why you feel the way you feel. I can ask you a follow-up question. So there's an opportunity to go into a lot of depth. Now, the drawback with interviews and with qualitative research in general is that we have what? A smaller sample size. So you can't generalize. You can't really say that you've represented the population in any meaningful way, right? So, having said that, let's look at this really quickly. The 4 kinds of interviews. There are 4 different kinds of interviews that we might employ in our field. There's the informal research interview. This is where there's very few controls. It's not organized. It's not focused. We're just trying to introduce ourselves, right, to the people that we're studying. These are just conversations. We're trying to gain some initial information, but informal interviews are usually not. They're usually not going to be a standalone method, right? That's not going to be your standalone data collection method. Then you have the unstructured interview, and these are much more popular, and these will be used as data collection methods in many cases. Here, the researcher is pretty focused. They're trying to gain some very specific information, but there's still relatively little control, right? It's not as formal as some of the other, as semi-structured and structured interviews, which I'll talk about in a second. But with unstructured interviews, you are going to sit down with people. You're going to have probably a list of questions. It might not be rigid. It might not be strict. You can probably deviate a little bit because, again, it's still pretty unstructured. But you're trying to gain some specific information here. So many of the interviews that are done in our field are unstructured. But semi-structured interviews are probably the most popular. These are, if you read through the literature and if you read a bunch of studies that have employed interviews as a method, this is probably the one you'll see more than any of the others, right? Semi-structured interviews. Here, the reviewer has a written list of questions, right? And it's pretty formal. It's relatively rigid, right? You're going to go from question 1 to question 2 to question 3, but you're trying to maintain a relatively casual quality, right? You still want it to kind of appear like a conversation. So you're kind of trying to strike a balance, right? You don't want it to necessarily appear hyper formal, hyper structured, but at the same time you have a clear aim, you have a set of questions, and you want to try to get through them and document your informant's answers very thoroughly. Notice that I'm using the word informant now. I'm not using the word subject. We talk about subjects in quantitative research. In qualitative research, qualitative researchers don't like that word, subject, right? It's kind of offensive to a lot of qualitative researchers. So we use the word informant. Just the person or the people that are giving you information are your informants. The last kind of interview is the structured interview. This is where there's a very specific, very rigid schedule. It's like question 1, and then it's like, okay, if the informant says this, then ask him this. If the informant says this, then ask him this, right? There's like very specific instructions. In fact, structured interviews are so formal and so rigid that in some cases you don't even need the researcher to give the interview. I mean, it could just be anybody because it's so rigid. You just have basically you could just have anybody come in and step in for you and deliver the interviews because there's a detailed schedule of what should be said, even all the follow-up questions. So this is and these are relatively common as well, but like I said, semi-structured interviews are the most common that you'll find in our field. Now, how do you actually go about interviewing people? Well, once you kind of have an idea of what you want to do, and you've gathered your informants, I mean, you have to have a sample. Usually it's a relatively small sample. In qualitative research, remember, you're not going to be interviewing hundreds of people. You might survey hundreds of people or even thousands, but you can't interview hundreds of people. You might interview tens of people, 30, 40 people. When I did my dissertation, I interviewed 83 people, which is a lot. That is a ton of interviews. But that's because it was a PhD dissertation, so the research is done over a longer period of time. But you always want to make sure that you keep your aim in mind, right? Your research purpose. Think about how your interview questions relate to your basic research purpose, right? Are they helping you? Are your interview questions helping you answer your research questions? If they're not, then you should drop them. If they are, then that's good. Make sure that you guarantee anonymity. This is very important. If you don't guarantee anonymity, and we talked about this with surveys, but it's really important with interviews, because in interviews, a lot of times, people are really going to be spilling their guts. And remember, they're talking to you. They're talking directly to you. Whereas in a survey, they're just going to slip you a piece of paper. And in most cases, or they're doing it online, you're not going to be able to associate their responses with the person. But now you're getting the response from the person, from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So it's really important. It's important in surveys, but it's doubly important in interviews that you tell people, these results are anonymous. I'm not going to share this with anybody. I'm not going to put your name out there. I'm not going to associate your responses with your name at all. The only people that will know what you've said are me and you. You have to make that very clear to your informants. Make sure that you're accurate. Nothing is more annoying to an informant than if you have documented what they've said inaccurately. And I have been misquoted before by journalists, which is obviously a different kind of interview, but it's annoying. And so you have to be very careful. If you can tape record your interview, tape record it. If you can't, because the informant doesn't give you permission, or you just don't have permission to record or whatever, or you don't have a recorder, then make sure you take really detailed notes and document everything. I mean, take really detailed notes. And then double check too. It's okay to, at the end, it's okay to say, with your informant still there, it's okay to say, I'd like to go back over some of the quotes that I have for you. And then they can, even correct stuff. They may have worded something awkwardly, and they may want to just like tighten up the wording in a particular sentence or whatever, and that's fine to have them, to give them the opportunity to revise their quotes. Avoid leading questions, just like with surveys, right? Don't lead them into the correct answer, right? You want this to be very objective. You want to be very welcoming. Do not be judgmental. Stay focused. Sometimes in interviews, this is one of the drawbacks. An interviewee, an informant, will just talk your ear off, right? There are those people that they're just kind of, happy that someone's listening to them. They have a gripe and they just want to talk, and they'll go off topic. And you have to be able to, you have to have a skill to be able to bring them back, because you don't have time to waste. I mean, you're doing a research project, and all this information isn't helping you. So you have to be able to bring them back. So do things like, stop them in a polite way and say, that's really interesting, but I want to go back to what you were saying a minute ago about, whatever the topic is. So try to interject. And again, it's good if you can establish some kind of a rapport with your interviewee, right? Be friendly, and that will help in this regard. Make sure that your questions are clear. You can even ask people, is that clear? I mean, you can't do that in a survey, but in an interview you can do that. But make sure they understand what you're saying. I already mentioned, don't be judgmental. This is very important. You can't be like, when somebody's answering your questions, you can't be like rolling your eyes and going stuff like, you can't do that. That doesn't work. People are gonna tighten up real quick, and they're gonna walk away from the interview, or they're just gonna start telling you what they think you want to hear. And nobody wants to look bad, right? So you don't want that. You want them to be honest, unfiltered. Get people to keep talking. This is one of the big skills in interviews. You don't want to shut them up. If they're giving you good information, you want them to keep talking. And sometimes you have to know when not to interject, when someone's kind of on a roll, or if they kind of give that little pause, and you can kind of do the old just to kind of get them, to cue them, right, to keep speaking because you like what they're saying. Take notes about everything in an interview, right? Jot down the location, jot down the time, jot down the setting, jot down what the person was wearing, were they nervous? You never know when that information might be useful, right? You never know when you might find a pattern or something with many of your interviewees, and you might even make mention of it. Be a good listener. Don't interrupt unless they're getting off topic, right? But be a good listener. That's a very, very important trait. And make sure that you're actually paying attention. Don't be interviewing somebody and then like you're looking down at your phone and you're doing all, and you're not taking notes and you're looking away and you're eating or whatever. Don't do that. You have to be a good listener and take notes. Now, one of the big challenges with interviews is that you're going to have a massive amount of data. So when I interviewed 83 people in Egypt, 83 journalists, I ended up with something like, I think it was around 200 pages of notes. from those interviews. And it's like, I'm talking Microsoft Word, single spaced. I mean, it was a lot of notes. I mean, it was incredible. And I remember just looking through that file and just going, oh my God, how am I going to make sense of this? And so you have to try to find a way to make sense of all this data. It's easy in a survey. That's the easy part with surveys, right? Maybe you don't get the depth, but it's easy to tabulate. Okay, well, 34% of the people said B for that question. That's pretty easy. But with an interview, it's much more difficult. So what you have to try to do, what I recommend is using kind of a coding strategy, not coding like in content analysis, a different kind of coding, like maybe color coding, where you look for certain patterns. Okay, this guy said this, and this gal, she said this, so she said something similar, so let me color code that as green, right? You might identify themes, and that's what I did. So like I had journalists talk to me about the restrictions that they faced from the government there, restrictions on their reporting. So every time somebody would say something about restrictions, I would like highlight that in green or yellow or whatever. And then I could go back to all of the green highlights and see what people were saying, and then I could make sense of it that way, right? So you identify patterns, you identify themes. I highly recommend, before you do anything, read through the material at least once, if not twice, just to remind yourself what people said and just to kind of refamiliarize yourself. Because it will have been some time before you listened to, some of the early interviewees, unless you're doing all the interviews like in one day, which is pretty rare. So some challenges with interviews. One, people don't always tell the truth. You have to kind of be smart, but sometimes people embellish the facts. They want to look good or whatever. They might be concealing things from you. So it's always a challenge dealing with people. Human beings are flawed. People don't always remember things accurately. I have a terrible memory. My mom is constantly teasing me about my memory. So if you ask me something in an interview, I mean, I might not remember what happened last week, let alone something that happened a year or two ago. So you have to be aware of that, and that's why if you can avoid asking for really detailed information, you should avoid that, right? Something that requires a really strong memory, because you don't want to have people like really stretching and like saying, "Oh well, I think what happened was." You don't want that. You don't want "I think." You don't like "I think." You want "I know." This is what happened, right? People sometimes, I mean, I've interviewed people that just don't have anything useful to say, and I try to end those interviews like quickly. Usually you can tell very early on that someone's not talkative, they just don't want to share information, or they just don't have information, or it's just the wrong guy. I mean, it just shouldn't have been included in the sample. So you have to just move on from those people. Sometimes people will tell you what they think you want to hear, and you want to avoid that. You might think, "Oh, that's great. They're telling me what I want to hear." But no, that damages your study. That harms the validity of your study. So you want to make sure that people are telling you the truth, right? Not telling you what you want to hear. People sometimes, use language in different ways. So words have multiple meanings. So you always want to just make sure that you understand what people are saying to you and that they understand what you're saying to them. That's interviews, quick and dirty. That was a quick overview. Read through the text on that as well. The book. But it's pretty straightforward. It's one of those things that you just kind of have to get the hang of. Once you've done it a few times, it'll get easier. Doing interviews, I mean. And if you have questions, do let me know, as always. Textual analysis is another very prominent qualitative research method. One of the more prominent qualitative methods. And I use textual analysis a lot. I've published at least, I want to say, 2, maybe more textual analyses. But, and this is really valuable because, if you want to learn about what a text says, You can do content analysis, and I love content analysis, but sometimes content analysis is limiting, right? I mean, it can't tell you everything. A textual analysis is really nice because you can really study the deep meanings that are contained within the text, right? You can like read the sentence carefully and look at the specific words that were used and pay attention to the sentence that came before and the sentence that came after, and think about who the author is, and think about the historical context in which this particular statement was uttered, and you can really construct a pretty convincing story based on that entire context. That's what we do in textual analysis, right? Again, the drawback: smaller sample, not going to be able to generalize, but you can go into a lot of depth. And I've read some just outstanding textual analyses that are really convincing, right, in the way they argue what a text means. It's very important to understand that texts are not produced in vacuums. They come out of a context, they come out of a history, and so you have to engage that history and that context when you do a textual analysis. That is expected of you. So some people think, oh, textual analysis, it's going to be real easy. I just read this text or watch this movie or listen to this song and tell you what I think about it. No, it's not that simple. People are going to just shoot your textual analysis down if that's all you're doing. If you're just winging it. If you've done it properly, you've become really well read. You understand the context. You understand the history, and you're referencing that stuff. You understand the literature. You understand a particular theoretical framework that is informing your interpretation. And this is interpretive. All qualitative research is interpretive. We understand that. There's an inherent level of subjectivity here. It's not perfectly objective. And it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be sort of subjective. And that's okay. It's an interpretive paradigm, right? But you have to be able to engage the context and the history, the social circumstances, right, in order to understand the text and then deliver the meaning to your readers. So whereas content analysis is concerned primarily, not exclusively, we talked about this when we talked about content analysis, but primarily concerned with outward meanings, right, the manifest meanings. Textual analysis is concerned with the outward meanings, but also the latent meanings. And the latent meanings are actually more important in the textual analysis. That's where people are looking for your interpretation. They want to understand what's hidden, what's the deep meaning of this text. How do we do textual analysis? How do you start? What do you do? What do you look for? Well, the first thing that you should probably do is understand the social moment, understand the context, right? If you're looking at a speech, let's say you want to do a textual analysis of one of President Obama's speeches. What is the context? Who's President Obama? What is going on in America in 2015? What's happening? What's the political context? Who are the president's proponents and who are their opponents? What are the who are the president's opponents? What are the key hot button issues of the time, right? How does all that play into his speech? You want to think about that, read, and try to study up on that context. Then you have to pay attention to things like word choice. What specific words did the president use in his speech? What figures of speech and expressions are used? What narrative devices are used? What's included? What's excluded? What's highlighted, right? Are there certain associations being made? Does the president associate someone or something with something else, right? Those are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about and looking for in a textual analysis. And I've posted online, if I haven't posted it already, I will. There's like a little kind of a guide to textual analysis that you'll find that I think will be really helpful and just read that. I'll take you 5 minutes to just kind of read through it. It's actually like it goes through kind of an analysis of one of Madonna's music videos, right, using textual analysis, which is kind of interesting. And again, just like with interviews, you want to be able to analyze and code content according to certain patterns and themes. And again, I would use this is just my preference. You don't have to do this, but I would do some color coordinating kind of a coding scheme, basically, to help you make sense of it. That's what I do. And with textual analysis, like with interviews, and really all qualitative methods, you want to employ thick description. I want you to know this term, thick description. That just means go into a ton of detail. Thick description applies to all of the qualitative methods. We want to go into a lot of detail. Provide really convincing interpretations. Don't just tell someone, well, President Obama in his speech said this, and this is what it means. No, convince us that that's what it means, right? Go into detail, right? Give us background. Give us context, and convince us with that thick description. The third method that I want to look at today is the focus group. I think what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to stop here. We'll divide this into two. We're about halfway through, so this is probably a good stopping point. Stay tuned for part 2 of Lesson 9.